Welcome everyone to this, our fourth roundtable and ninth event in the Canadian Historical Association's virtual workshop and roundtable series. Thank you all very, very much for joining us today for this important event. My name is Dave Hazan. I am a graduate student at York University's Department of History and one of the CHA's two organizers in charge of moderating the series. It's my very distinct pleasure today to discuss towards a more global CHA with our distinguished guests, the chair, Alexandra Dubé, Juanita de Barros, Meredith Tureta, Twisha Singh, Paula Hastings, and soon to be joining us, Wendell Adjete. Bienvenue à notre quatrième table ronde et neuvième événement de la série d'ateliers et tables rondes virtuelles de la Société historique du Canada. Merci beaucoup à tous de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour cet événement important. Je m'appelle Dave Hazan et je suis un doctorant à l'Université York et l'un des deux organisateurs du SHC en charge de l'animation de cette série. J'ai l'immense plaisir aujourd'hui de vous présenter en discussion au sujet vers une SHC plus globale avec nos invités distingués, Alexandre Dubé, Juanita de Barros, Meredith Tureta, Wendell Adjete, Twisha Singh et Paula Hastings. Nous commencerons avec la reconnaissance de notre présence sur les terres autochtones. Je suis à Toronto, où est située l'Université York. Alors, j'utiliserai le texte de mon institution. Je vous invite à réfléchir aux terres autochtones sur lesquelles vous êtes maintenant. L'Université York reconnaît sa présence sur le territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations autochtones. La région connue comme Takaranto a été préservée par la nation Anishinaabeg, la Confédération Haudenosaunee, les Hurons-Wendat et les Métis. Elle est désormais le foyer d'un grand nombre de peuples autochtones. Nous reconnaissons le titulaire actuel du traité, la Première Nation des Mississauga du Credit. Ce territoire est soumis au traité de la ceinture wampum, Dish with One Spoon, entente définissant le partage et la préservation pacifique de la région des Grands Lacs. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. Pardon me. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt covenants, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our chair, Dr. Alexandre Dubé. Dr. Alexandre Dubé est professeur régulier au département de sciences humaines et sociales de l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, où il enseigne l'histoire du Canada, de la Nouvelle-France et du monde atlantique. Docteur en histoire de l'Université McGill, ses intérêts portent sur l'histoire du politique, de l'État, de l'économie politique et de la culture matérielle. Ancien fellow de l'Université Caltech, il a enseigné de nombreuses années à la Washington University de Saint-Louis. Ses recherches lui ont en outre mérité des bourses postdoctorales de l'Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture et de la John Carter Brown Library. Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Merci à tous. Alors, bienvenue à tous à cette table ronde sur vers une société historique du Canada plus globale. Merci aux participants d'avoir voulu se prêter au jeu. Je vais commencer en français puisque ça fait un petit moment que je n'ai pas utilisé mon anglais. Là, il faut que je me dérouille un peu. Oui, alors la conversation, je présume, mais j'invite tout le monde à participer ou à faire leurs interventions dans la langue de leur choix. Je présume, compte tenu de nos participants, qu'elle se fera largement en anglais. Je ferai la présentation de nos participants en anglais tout à l'heure, mais évidemment, j'invite questions et interventions dans la langue de votre choix. Et quant à cette situation, si cela vous intéresse, je vous invite à regarder la précédente table ronde de la SHC, par-delà les deux solitudes, qui traite précisément de la question linguistique à la SHC. Our topic for today is an old one for the CHA. The CHA has the I'm not really sure if I want to use the uneasy, but rather like the kind of conflicted beginning of both being an association that purports to represent all historians in Canada, regardless of their fields of study, but at the same time has historically been the playing field, or at least the professional association that has attracted mostly historians of Canadian history. That tension is not new. In fact, if we look into the archive of the Society, we can see that it's already being discussed in the 1930s and is an ongoing debate, a recurring one, and an important one, which I think is one that we need to be doing every few years or so, precisely because of that tension, and precisely perhaps because of what Canadian history is, represents, or what we want it to be. So to talk about this and explore further these issues today, we have a panel of remarkable scholars whose contribution to both Canadian history and global history are quite extensive. And I'm going to present them in turn in the order that they will intervene in our conversation today. And then, they will present their own views of that. I'm not sure I want to use delicate. I just think it's an important question and one that is a recurring one, but that central question of global history and global CHA, two things being linked. So they're going to make their presentation and we're going to foster the discussion after that. So first we'll have Juanita de Barros. Juanita de Barros is professor in the Department of History at McMaster University and is also a director of McMaster's Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. She's also a former president of the Canadian Association of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. She teaches courses on the history of the Caribbean, imperial history, the history of the African diaspora, and the history of colonial health and medicine. She is also an associate fellow with the Center for Research in Latin American and Caribbean Studies and is associated with the Harriet Tubman Institute for Research on the Global Migrations of African People. Her research concentrates on 19th and 20th century Caribbean in the context of African diaspora and British Empire, and addresses topics such as urban history, gender, history of childhood, social history of health and medicine, and reproductive health. Her most recent book is Reproducing the British Caribbean, Sex, Gender, and Population Politics After Slavery, published by UNC Press in 2014, and explores the ideas and policies about population growth and infant and maternal welfare in British Caribbean colonies from the 19th century to the 1930s. I want also to mention one recent article that she penned, The Death of Molly Schultz, Race, Magic, and the Law. It's a prize-winning article, Race, Magic, and the Law in the Post-Slavery Caribbean, published in the Journal of Social History, 2021. Then we will hear Meredith Tereda. Meredith Tereda is professor of history at University of Ottawa. Her work examines the trans-regional legal and rights activism, both past and contemporary. Her work examines trans-regional legal and rights activism, and I really like that formulation, the mixed outcomes of international solidarities. Her most recent monograph is Nation of Outlaws, State Violence, Nationalism, Grassfields, Traditions, and State Building in Cameroon. And she is currently working on a new book tentatively titled Activism and the Fringes of Empire, Rogue Lawyers and Rights Advocates in 20th Century Africa. Amongst her many publications, I'll just take the opportunity to cite this one in French, Avocat de la cause anticoloniale, activisme politique et état de droit dans l'Afrique française, 1946-1960, et c'est publié dans Politique africaine en 2015. Next, we're going to hear from Twisha Singh. Twisha is a PhD research scholar, an advanced PhD candidate. In fact, she is defending very, very soon at the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill Universities. She joined the department in 2016 and worked under the supervision of Elizabeth Alborn and Subo Basu. Her research area include modern British history, South Asian history, theater and performance studies, gender and sexuality studies, and her theoretical approaches include feminist and post-colonial literary theories. Her project analyzes political engagement, socioeconomic identity, occupational mobility, and creative labor of women working as stage actresses in Calcutta and London. Her dissertation is titled The Infamous Performer, a study of creative labor and social political identity of stage actresses in London, Calcutta, 1850 to 1950. And as I said, she's defending very soon. She's also been part of multi-university projects on memory and oral history, modalities of cultural trauma, which is located or centered at University of Zagreb in Croatia. After that, we'll hear from Paula Hastings. Paula is an associate professor of history at the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies at University of Toronto Scarborough and a tri-campus graduate program at University of Toronto. Her research and teaching centers on the imperial and global contexts of Canada, political, social, and cultural histories during the 19th and 20th century. She is interested more specifically in Canada's evolving relationship with Britain and the Caribbean since the Confederation, and the histories of imperialism, colonialism, race, migration, and nationalism. Her book, Dominion Over Palm and Pine, A History of Canadian Aspirations in the British Caribbean, was just published last September by McGill Queen's. Congratulations. And she's conducting research on a second book-length project tentatively titled Reorienting the Map Around the Pacific, the Panama Canal, and Shifting Spatial Imaginaries in 20th Century Canada. Amongst her many publications, I'll just mention this one because I really like it and I've taught it to great success in the classroom. Our glorious Anglo-Saxon race shall ever fill the earth's highest place. The Anglo-Saxon and the construction of identity in late 19th century Canada. And that is in Philip Buckner and Doug Francis' Canada and the British World. That was published in 2006. Yeah. And lastly is Wendell. No, Wendell hasn't arrived yet, but we will be eventually joined by Wendell Adjeti, who's currently teaching and assistant professor of history at McGill University. His upcoming book, Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of a Pan-African North America, situates fundamental questions of 20th century US history, immigration, civil rights, racial identity, revolution, counter-revolution, imperialism, and neocolonialism within a diasporic North American and transatlantic frame. Professor Adjeti's new project also includes a study of warfare and African-led abolitionism on the Gulf of Guinea Coast, and gender and messianic Black revolutionary leadership in the United States. Amongst his publications, I would like to signal In Search of Ethiopia, Messianic Pan-Africanism, and the Problem of the Promised Land, 1919-1931. And that's been published by the Canadian Historical Review in 2021, so very recently. So these are our wonderful panelists. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the virtual floor to Juanita Navarro's and to share her reflections on towards a more global CHA.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Stephen, for inviting me to participate in this really interesting event and to talk to these colleagues and exchange some of our thoughts about this subject. So I was so intrigued what was mentioned early in the introduction that this has been a conversation in the CHA going back to the 1930s. I just found that absolutely fascinating. So we had among the panelists, when Stephen first invited us to participate in this, sort of an initial email exchange. And I found, Meredith, that you actually had a really interesting point, and you were sort of pondering the terms that we as historians use to define ourselves. And so specifically, whether historians who don't conduct research on or teach Canadian history define ourselves as sort of quote unquote non-Canadianists. And I found that observation really intriguing. And it sort of prompted me to think about how I define myself as a researcher, as a historian, and as a university teacher, how that definition has changed over time, and how that intersects with the CHA's, with the question that's at the heart of this conversation about the CHA's interest in becoming more global, or more global. So what I'm going to do in the few minutes that I have is I'll say a couple of words about my research and then my teaching in this respect. And then I'm going to conclude by coming back to thinking about a more global CHA, how that is in fact possible. So first of all, in terms of my research, so like a lot of historians, I've been increasingly moving away from focusing on one territory to researching from a more comparative perspective. I was trained as a historian of one particular region, so that is the Caribbean. But like many Caribbeanists, I focused on one, at least that was certainly the case when I was doing my doctoral dissertation and archival work in the 1990s. I focused on one colony, and so that colony was British Guiana, or today Guyana. It's an independent nation. And in fact, even within working on Guyana, I actually concentrated on the capital city, Georgetown. And to be perfectly honest, if I could have focused on like about 4 square blocks, I probably would have done that. So to say that my doctoral work was geographically limited is a pretty dramatic understatement. But the topics I was interested in, sort of broadly, the place of race, class, and gender within the context of colonial institutions that deal with social welfare and health, led me to move my research away from Georgetown and away from British Guiana. And so these interests sort of over, the last couple of decades have made me become much more of a regional historian, much more of a comparative historian, and someone who focuses on a number of Caribbean colonies. And so someone who looks for connections to developments also in other parts of the British Empire, including Canada. And so I find myself regularly looking for colonial officials as they moved from the Caribbean to Canada and back and forth. I regularly look for Canadian laws to see what kind of an impact, especially my recent project on the history of abortion in the Caribbean, the influence of, or possible influence of, Canadian abortion laws on those in the Caribbean. So I find myself sort of looking for connections between Canada, between the Caribbean and other parts of the empire, including Canada. And so now I sort of see myself, and I define myself really as a Caribbean historian fundamentally, but someone who works on the intersection between health and the law within an imperial context. So not just someone who works on Guyana, but someone who works in a much broader context. This evolution reflects primarily intellectual curiosity. So as I've sort of indicated, the subjects I'm interested in, so specifically the emergence and evolution of public policies and government institutions in the realm of health and social welfare, really has encouraged me to think comparatively within the context of the British Caribbean, and to look for connections with other parts of the British Empire and much more broadly. And so in essence, the questions I'm interested in exploring as a historian just can't be answered by looking at a single colony or even a group of colonies like the British Caribbean. I have to move much more widely than that. But so, so my evolution as sort of a more comparative, trans-regional sort of historian also reflects my work as a teacher. So, and this is, again, a pretty common phenomenon for many historians. So the 2 permanent teaching positions I've had, so an earlier one at the University of Western Michigan, and my current position where I've been master for the last 18 years, those positions were for trans-regional historians. And so the job at Western Michigan was for a British Empire historian, and then my job at Mac is as an Atlantic historian. And so in both of these positions, I was when I was at Western Michigan, and now at Mac, I've been fortunate enough to be able to teach courses that focus on the Caribbean at the undergraduate level. But I've also, as a reflection of the position that I was hired for, but also as in response to student interest and demand, I've also been developing thematic trans-regional courses at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And, practically speaking, there's students who are interested in studying Caribbean history, but not enough to sustain the kind of large courses that universities want these days. And so I've been increasingly developing sort of trans-regional comparative courses. So at the undergraduate level, a history of slavery, a global history of medicine, for example, and at the graduate level, colonial history of health and medicine. All those courses have a Caribbean component, but they are very much trans-regional and thematic in focus. And so that sort of brings me to come back to the question that this roundtable is sort of organized around, so the possibilities for a more global CHA. And so I think that the kind of comparative trans-regional work and thematic nature of the work that a lot of us are doing provides an opportunity for the CHA to increase its appeal to historians who don't work on Canadian history exclusively or even at all. But, you know, in kind of thinking about that, I found myself wondering, I mean, how does that even get facilitated? I mean, how is that even made possible? And I was sort of, you know, meditating on a recent experience I had in presenting some co-written research on Caribbean migration to Canada at the CHA last spring, I guess. And it sort of made me think about this a little bit. And so a colleague and I have been doing some research on Caribbean migration to Canada, and we presented our work at the CHA because we were looking for a venue in Canada to present this research. And so we reached out to a panel organizer. I think I saw the call for papers on one of my email feeds. I can't even remember where it came from. And we thought, okay, so this could be a great venue. But I find myself wondering in the context of this panel, if there hadn't been a Canadian element to our work, and if we hadn't been looking for a Canadian venue, if in fact we would have reached out to this panel organizer at the CHA to present our research. If this paper had been, for example, solely on a Caribbean topic, realistically, I probably would have just gone to the ACH, the Association of Caribbean Historians, right? And so that really makes so the question is, would I have presented this work in a Canadian context, in the context of the CHA, if it didn't have a Canadian element? And I think actually the answer to that is no. And so I'm sort of wondering in this session, what would have changed that no to a yes? Right? I mean, what would make me a Caribbean historian and someone who is very sort of a trans-regional and thematic in her approach? What would bring me to try to see the CHA as sort of one of my go-to venues, right? And so I don't have an answer to that. That's just sort of one of the questions I think I'd like us to think about maybe in the discussion. And I think it's important because there are rewards for the CHA, but there are also rewards for us, for historians. It helps us connect with our colleagues here in Canada. It's intellectually incredibly enriching. I mean, my experience at the CHA in the spring was fantastic. We got wonderful feedback that I would not have got in another venue. And so I think that the rewards are totally two-sided. So this is really an initiative, or these are really questions that are worth pursuing. And I think I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to seeing what everybody else has to say. So thanks.
Thank you, Juanita. I think this really just sets the table, or the conversational agenda for the next 2 hours with really fruitful questions. So next we'll turn, and I'm sure we'll return to it in the plenary part of this roundtable. But first, we'll turn to Meredith Terada for her own reflections on these topics, which, as you've heard, was already submitted to us participants in the roundtable through email, and a very appreciated first jab at the topic. Meredith.
Merci, Alexandre. You used the word jab, so hopefully it won't be taken as too adversarial or too attacking, but I will come back to that question as well. And thanks, Juanita, for putting it out there to start with. So I don't really have, first of all, thanks to everyone for coming and participating in this. And thanks encore une fois, Alexandre, pour l'introduction. Très sympa. And I just want to say I'm getting to know the CHA now. I mean, I was always aware of its existence since coming to work as a historian in Canada in 2007. But now I'm on the council. So I'm just kind of learning about the lay of the land. So I don't know that I really have prescriptive answers for how to make the association more global. But like Juanita, I was drawn immediately when contacted about my willingness to participate in this panel. It was something that really resonated with me. Because like Juanita, you know, I was trained with a very bordered geographical focus. I was trained as a historian of equatorial Africa and sort of an area studies moment or era rather in the United States. And so this was a very, you know, the local was very much emphasized, the learning of indigenous languages, field research with oral histories, those kinds of things. So my path has been, I mean, like Juanita, my dissertation was very locally focused in Cameroon. And then one of the things I noticed during that dissertation research was that the actors that I was focused on, who were, you know, political actors who were struggling for the independence of Cameroon from British and French rule, they were themselves internationalists, and they had international trajectories. They had transnational trajectories, trans-regional trajectories, whatever you want to call it, whether those trajectories were taking them towards a sort of Pan-African outlook, or whether they were taking them towards the United Nations, because the jurisdictional status of Cameroon was such that these were United Nations trusteeship territories. And this means that the actors I was focused on were very acutely focused themselves on the United Nations. So there were things that would come up in my data. For instance, Cameroonian nationalists sending petitions to the United Nations and using, in the late 1950s, an address care of the International League of the Rights of Man in Midtown Manhattan in New York. And my supervisor sort of encouraged me to put these questions to the side and sort of leave them for IR types and political scientists, right? But, and that's what I ended up doing. I did write a very sort of locally focused dissertation analyzing the articulation between liberationist or anti-colonial politics and local political culture. But I would say since 2010 or so, all of my published work has been, has incorporated some kind of border crossing. And that's what's carried me forward as a historian who's moved from this very focused area studies background to one who works on rights claims as generative of new connections, ruptures, and contestations. And this, of course, has led to new insights. And it's given me a way to connect conceptually with historians trained in all kinds of geographies and intellectual histories. So it's pushed me across disciplinary boundaries as well, into forums where, you know, sometimes I'm the only historian in the room. And that in turn has made me think in terms of new projects and collaboration. So this is sort of an autobiographical, I'm like Juanita, I'm sort of starting off with a brief autobiography of why it is that the notion of a global CHA is so important to me. And then I wanted to make two more brief points. And one of them, again, Juanita and I did not consult, but we're actually following your lead in terms of moving into what this transformation as a historian prompted me to do as a teacher. And so for my second brief point, I guess I want to just mention the History Across Borders initiative that 7 or 8 colleagues and I undertook at the University of Ottawa, Department of History. Starting in about 2017 or so is when we began to conceptualize this. And we intentionally came together because we wanted to facilitate having conversations with students and with each other across the boundaries of our specializations. So from the get-go in this group, what's interesting about it is that all the global geographies were represented. I mean, we had Americanists, we had Canadianists, we had Europeanists, Latin Americanists, historians of Africa, Asia, and Middle East, a historian of indigenous populations, a historian of science and technology. So as a group, we met several times to discuss how to bring this trans-regional approach into our curriculum. And we ended up with this broad thematic framing, the history across borders, which is a series of courses and seminars that we put on at the 3rd and the 4th year levels. So the descriptive purpose that appears in the course catalog is, quote, exploration of problems and issues that cut across spatial, temporal, and disciplinary boundaries, study of historical connections and processes, examination of various national experiences within a trans-regional context. So that's the descriptive language for the course codes. But each semester that the courses run, any given instructor brings their own subtitle along to add and put on for that course code. So just to give you an array of some of the courses that we've run using these codes: history of human rights, history of refuge seeking, history of trauma, history of disease, the Atlantic world, soccer, culture, and politics in Latin America. So that's not a comprehensive list, it's just to give you an idea. And as you might imagine, the instructors who are teaching in this History Across Borders series have been trained, like Juanita, like me, with area specializations in various geographies: Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Canada. I mean, Canadianists are teaching in this series, it's important to note. American history. And as for periodization, this series attracts instructors trained in medieval, as well as early modern periods, and so on. And it's challenging to geographically categorize these courses, just as it is challenging to geographically categorize methodological courses or different approaches. And here I'm thinking of maybe public history and digital history. These are courses that we're putting on more and more. So these courses tend to get filed as other in any instance in which someone's trying to maybe put a BA program together thinking about geography. So these courses pile up in the other, and the other category is getting larger and larger over time. So that brings me to my last point, where I'll sort of circle back to the initial planning stages in the email to which Juanita was referring. And it circles back to the purpose of the panel today, which is to make the CHA more global. So as I was invited to participate in the panel, I got hung up on the central question, and it's the question that figures in the description that brought you here as well. So this is the question: what do we as an association need to do to build relationships with non-Canadianists teaching at Canadian universities? So not to get too philosophical, but non or other is not an identity. It's a label applied by someone who is not whatever it is that they're describing. The historical data tell us that it's not an inclusive label, by the way. I think we should put that out there. So who recognizes themselves in the label non-Canadianist? I mean, I want to just let that sit there for a minute. I don't. But the interesting thing about it is that I observe a number of historians trained in the history of Canada who also now privilege other ways of describing what they do over the geographical. So I guess I'll end with the question, like, how do we juxtapose this language of Canadianist and non with this age where more and more researchers are doing comparative, thematic, connected, trans-regional, diasporic, etc. history, which may or may not include Canada? And is this binary, Canadianist and non-Canadianist, that figures as our central starting question here today, is it working at cross purposes with the implied intent of the panel? So maybe in the conversation as it unfolds, we can think of ways to tweak this starting question to help us better get to where we want to go. Thanks.
Thank you, Meredith, for, excuse me for the lull there. I was just taking furiously notes for the future conversation. So thank you so much, Meredith, for questions that A, prompted me to write down notes to just further the conversation, B, looking forward to when we get to that point, and C, look to see how our next presenter Twisha Singh is going to either build or just further and nurture that conversation along. So Twisha, we're going to leave the metaphorical virtual floor to you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for that introduction. A slight tweak, I started my PhD in the year 2017, which not in the year 2016, and I am about to submit this year. So I am considering myself as a pandemic PhD, technically, if that's a category at all. So I would like to also thank Professor Stephen High for inviting me today to this very, very important discussion. Thank you, Juanita and Meredith, for setting the platform for the conversation, and especially what Meredith, I was like nodding with a lot of literally vehemently that why this term of non-Canadianists. So thank you so much for putting that forth, because that's what stuck with me when I read the two important questions this panel deals with. So I am primarily, I don't identify with one specialization. So my dissertation sort of moves away from like categorizing myself as a South Asianist or a modern British historian. I'm doing both. There are conversations where historians think that the history of the empire cannot be de-linked with the history of the colony or vice versa. I am looking at it as a transnational history. So a little bit about what I'm working on. I am basically analyzing, examining the history of stage actresses between 1850 to 1915, both the cities of London and Calcutta, looking at their labor as legitimate creative labor, making it a part of the larger meta-narrative on labor, and how their political engagement basically enabled them in the first half of the 1900s to become part of political movements. So in London, I look at the suffrage movement, and in Calcutta, I look at the communist movement. So in that light, I've also published a couple of papers last year and in 2021 and 2022, but I have often been embroiled in this question whenever I'm applying for conferences or presentations, that where does my thesis fit in? Is it South Asia? Is it modern Britain? So I abide by none. It is a transnational history on women. Gender is the overarching theoretical category that I'm looking at, and not the geographical space. Apart from that, I have been working with the Canadian Historical Association as a member of the Graduate Students Committee since 2021. And to represent the students' voice is what concerns me the most in this panel. And that's why I agreed to be a part of this panel, which deals with global history. So instead of arguing for decategorizing, I'm arguing for more inclusivity of students, international students who are a part of Canadian universities. For example, McGill University, my university, it has 30% of the students are from international spaces, be it South Asia, Asia, Europe. So it becomes very important to talk about their experiences in basically being a part of the Department of History, and how they can further their career aspirations in becoming a part of the Canadian Historical Association. So me with my committee members at the CHA, we have been working hard to represent their voices more, so that there is more inclusivity in terms of conference presentations or in terms of their student engagement. Because what we felt in the first 2 years is that international students were not engaging as much with the Students' Committee or with that of any of the workshops that we organized. So a way out was to seek contact persons in different universities to reach out to the international students and making them aware that CHA represents history students, not just Canadianists, non-Canadianists. It's not categorizing. So that has been one of the major concerns of making it apparent, making it evident to other students that it is a global platform. With that, also the kind of discussions we are having today about the global, the international, the cross-national is, as we know, one of the most pertinent and promising strands of the new historiographical trends, and it has renewed historical interest in social and economic recently now, which is also connected. So there's a growing focus on the international and transnational history writing. Especially with my cohort, I've seen that with the younger cohort in my department, a lot of the students are writing cross-border, cross-national histories. And there has to be a space in the CHA, be it conferences, roundtables, workshops, to engage them more. So as the member of Graduate Students Committee, we are also working on that. Apart from that, more speaking from experience, is that there has been in the larger conferences, I also applied for the Canadian Historical Association's annual conference. It has been difficult to fit in my research, personally speaking from experience, in the larger context of the panels that are being organized in the conference, in the annual conference of the CHA. So one way out which I could think of is to have more interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary panels in the conference sections itself to engage students who are ready to participate, but they don't know where they'll fit in. And since there is a fee attached to the membership and also the conference, it deters the international students from becoming a part or applying for the conference where they cannot see a clear-cut panel where their research fits in. So that is one of the concerns which I would like to raise to other speakers this afternoon. And thank you so much for hearing me out. And I'm looking forward to the conversation at the end of the session.
Thank you, Trisha, and thank you for bringing the voice of the graduate students and international graduate students and their place or absence thereof at the CHA, because I do think it's an important piece of that conversation. Thank you again. And now we will move to Paula Hastings and her own reflection.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to Stephen for inviting me to the panel. And I just really enjoyed listening to what others had to say on the topic and approaching it from different angles. And when I thought about the questions that were posed for this roundtable, I thought that there were several dimensions to the question of how the CHA has been or might be or should be globalizing, or extending its engagement beyond Canada. And one dimension, of course, as many have already spoken about, is the kinds of research that's being conducted. And at the CHA, in particular, at the annual conference, and by CHA members that identify themselves as Canadianists, which I think really does make up the membership's core. And for several years now, I think there does seem to be a robust and growing interest in different aspects of the Canadian past, situating them in broader transnational and international and global contexts. And of course, this development reflects broader trends within many disciplines, within the humanities and the social sciences disciplines, I would say, since maybe back to the 1990s. And then another dimension is the extent of participation among those who do not have like a Canadian element to the research, who are based at Canadian institutions, because of course the CHA scope of representation is not limited to those who identify as Canadianists. So, and then a final dimension I was thinking about is the extent to which the organization is attracting graduate students and scholars who are working at institutions outside Canada, whether the research has a Canadian dimension or not. And I was interested in this dimension because, of course, one of the questions framing today's roundtable was how the annual CHA conference too might open outward to the world in future years. So when I was thinking about these questions, I kept thinking about the conference, the annual conference, and I was wondering what recent CHA programs might tell us about the extent of participation by those who do not have a Canadian element. I'm trying to avoid the term non-Canadianists, that don't have a Canadian element to the research, but are based in Canada on the one hand, and then on the other, international participation. So from scholars outside of Canada that may or may not have Canadian elements to their research. And my sense was that the participation of both of these groups was a fairly small proportion of annual participation. So I decided, I was quite ambitious at the start, and I thought I would look, the past 5-10 years of the CHA program. And I thank Michelle and Stephen for directing me towards those programs that have just recently been put on the new website of the association. And so I ended up collecting 2 sets of data from the CHA programs in 2015, 2017, and 2019. So I was collecting information about, the contributions of individuals who were affiliated with non-Canadian institutions, their participation in traditional panels, roundtables, poster presentations, and keynotes. And then the second one, the papers presented on topics without a Canadian element in traditional panels only. And I excluded roundtables and posters and keynotes because they tended to focus quite a bit on Canadian or Canada-based themes. Now, I'd hoped to include 2021, but as I said, I kind of underestimated how time consuming it would be to collect all this information. And I think 2021 would have been really helpful to include, not only because it would provide more recent data, but it was a virtual conference. So it would have been interesting to see whether there was an uptick in the first measure that, of international participation with fewer barriers to access the conference. So I should say, before I I'll show the data, which I use loosely in the chat in a moment, but I should say that I make no claims to having a sound methodology. Of course, there's duplication of conference attendees across roundtables and panels, which is probably the big thing. I didn't go through and take the time to account for that duplication when I was thinking about university affiliation. And the second thing is that, the Canadian content of particular papers was not always apparent from the titles. And so sometimes I had to make an educated guess based on the panelists' broader research area, which I gleaned mostly from Google. In that the first conference that I looked at was in the 2015 program that was at Ottawa. And there were 398 that I counted: roundtables, panels, keynotes, poster presentations. And so 23 of those 398 contributions came from individuals that were affiliated with institutions outside. But of course, there would be, again, duplication in the way of, participants being involved in panels, as well as being on roundtables as well. And then on the other measure, there were 290 traditional panels. So this was excluding roundtables, posters, and keynotes on topics with a Canadian element, without a Canadian element, or on thematic research questions that were not explicitly or discernibly grounded in a regional or national space. And so that figure was about 5%. And then for 2017, at TMU, it was 7% of people contributing were from universities outside Canada, and 11% of those participating in I think I may have cut off something here, make it difficult, but that figure 44 out of 408 or 11%. Yeah, no, I think that's correct. So that would be So that's the final conference. Sorry, the way that I've displayed it here is not, it's not very straightforward. But I mean, you can see the data in terms of like just rough percentages. As I said, there's a lot of duplication. So obviously we have to look at these numbers with caution. But so in 2017, at TMU it was 7%, and 7% and 10% of contributions within traditional panels. And then the final one from 2019 at UBC, contributions to pretty much everything was 11% for professionals and historians coming from non-Canadian universities. And then the final one was 17%, which I thought was a little bit of an uptick. So I'll kind of leave the data, you know, I think it's somewhat speaks for itself. I didn't really find it all that surprising. I think I was a little bit surprised at the higher, you know, proportion of historians from, or others that may not be historians, that participated coming from outside, coming from non-Canadian institutions. Thought that was really interesting. I don't know what I expected those numbers to be, but I didn't expect them to be as high as they were. And I was actually surprised at the tendency to see that papers be grounded in particular geographical or national contexts. And having thematic panels was something that I think there were a number of thematic panels, but the panelists would often, again, ground themselves in a particular national space when they were contributing to that panel. So I think that, you know, when I've been thinking about these questions and how to make the CHA perhaps look outward to the world, I think it's a really difficult question, a really important question. And I think that, you know, there are ways, just sort of very straightforward ways in which we might think about getting participation, more international participation, or I think maybe the more important question is encouraging participation within Canada, because that's, you know, within the mandate of the CHA to look after the you know, interests of all historians within Canada. That there may be ways to do that. And I have this inkling, and I guess I am a Canadian historian, but I think that maybe those who don't have Canadian elements to their research might be more interested in participating if there was a way, certainly, to bring other scholars working on similar projects with, you know, thematic synergies in as well from perhaps outside Canada or within Canada. And even just with the call for papers, when it comes out in the fall, there might be an effort to explicitly encourage, you know, transnational and thematic panels that are comprised of historians working within and without Canada. You know, as certainly there are many possibilities, as others have mentioned, for multinational, you know, panels designed around thematic synergies rather than rooted in place. And I think maybe the call for papers might also be more explicit about soliciting proposals from scholars whose research does not have a Canadian element, you know, both within and beyond Canada. And I think a final thing is that, you know, there are ongoing discussions, which I think maybe the discussions are not so ongoing anymore, about continuing to offer virtual or hybrid panels to remove barriers to participation for graduate students and precariously employed scholars. That we might consider the extent to which virtual panels might also attract more international participation. But I just want to conclude by saying that, you know, that I think that CHA membership, which I believe, and Michelle and Stephen will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's somewhere around 650, or last time I heard, I'm not sure. So I think it's relatively robust when we consider that membership in the American Historical Association is about 15,000, I believe. And I don't know how representative the AHA and the CHA are in relation to the actual number of nationally based history professionals that are working. But I think given the plethora of institutions in the United States compared to Canada and the AHA's more international membership, I think that 650 or so is a good figure. But of course, there's always more that we can do to attract new members. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Colleagues, good afternoon. It's great to connect with you all virtually. So I'm really thrilled that we're having this conversation. I'm often thinking about Canada and African peoples in a very global context. I'm often thinking about North America in a very global, hemispheric, transatlantic context as well. And when I think about the CHA, I think it is perfectly positioned to push boundaries in very serious sort of geographic ways, but to push boundaries that would allow for incorporating other historians, other experiences, students as well. And so one of the key takeaways that I learned over the course of writing my book is that African peoples in so many ways have made Canadian society such a global place, right? Whether Canada as a sort of pre-Confederation colony, Canada as a dominion, Canada as like an aspiring empire of sorts, which Professor Hastings so articulately has written on, or Canada as a junior partner to the United States. There's this notion that this is very much a society with citizens or with passersby who believe that it has sort of global reach and global implications. But it's so easy to omit that African contribution to the globalization or the internationalization of Canadian history. And I think this is where the CHA can really lend some heft and also some institutional and scholarly and historical or historiographical credibility by actually focusing on the ways that for example, African peoples and also African intellectuals, African activists have seen Canada as being sort of this hemispheric and sort of like a Western Hemisphere metropole of the British Empire, that Canada served as a gateway of sorts. And one way I think that would make a great deal of sense in terms of incorporating scholars from beyond Canada, and also making some of the work that we all do in our scholarship and in our sort of public engagement much more meaningful, would be to focus on the African diaspora. It's something that often is not spoken of specifically. It's something that we don't actually sort of engage with the type of rigor and vigor that we ought to. And so I would love to see the CHA taking up the question of the African diaspora and what does it mean, and even looking at its antecedents, again, going back to the times of New France and the British Empire, looking at the ways that what would become Canada is very much at the crossroads of what it means, what an African sort of diaspora in Atlantic world, what that means, and you know, in terms of individuals, in terms of ideas, in terms of even territory, right, and all the way to the sort of the present moment in terms of foreign policy, in terms of imperialism or colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. And so, firstly, just this idea of what the African diaspora means in terms of the CHA, and that might be sort of a point of entry to engage actors and intellectuals, historians from different parts of the world. And secondly, another way to bring, I would say, a more global perspective to our work and certainly to our body of historians. And I might slightly remove my historian's hat and sort of put on a more public policy focused type of hat. And I'm sure we have colleagues whose scholarship focuses on, whose scholarship have a more sort of policy implications where the African diaspora and the African continent are concerned. But one omission that I find absolutely fascinating is that when you look at recent trends of immigrants or the quote unquote like sending nations, right? We know that mainland China is very prominent, features prominently. The Indian subcontinent features prominently. Parts of what we now call the Middle East feature also prominently. And some parts of the Americas, but sort of a glaring gap, I would argue, and some observers would acknowledge, is that Africa, despite being the African continent, despite being sort of the fastest growing territory in this world, which is projected to have a significant sort of youth bulge. So like having a population with like an inverted triangle, like an upside down triangle, or pardon me, yeah, like a sort of a conventional triangle where the majority of the population are young people under 30 years of age. Africa does not feature prominently in terms of engagement with Canada itself. What are some potential blind spots that might arise as a result of this? How do us as scholars, as historians, and again, some of us who might have a more sort of policy-oriented scope to our work, how do we reckon with some of these trends, knowing the history, knowing sort of the connections of the British Empire to the African continent, the British Empire of which Canada still in some ways in the afterlife of the empire still remains a crown jewel of sorts? How do we make sense of that? How do we look at these trends and apply some type of meaningful implications and takeaways? So that's it for now. And you know, the hazard of joining a panel halfway through is that you don't know for how long to speak, and you don't want to embarrass yourself. So I'll stop there.
I just want to maybe kind of offer a little bit of synthesis, because I do think the question that Juanita has opened with, which is to say that, you know, and it resonated because I find myself in the exact same situation, right? Like where I have to ask myself, like, who do I want to talk to? And you know, like, would I present a paper on, say, you know, my French imperial agents of the 18th century in Canada or in the Caribbean Historical Association or any other venue that deals with, you know, Atlantic history or colonial history or even, you know, history of administration and bureaucracy? And I guess that, you know, the answer always depends on, you know, who I want to talk to. And I guess one way to frame it is, what do we have to do for people who do not, I'm going to use Paula's formulation, might not have a Canadian component to their research, to want to talk to those who do? Because the core membership of the CHA, I don't think will change, like it's suddenly like the Canadianists will, you know, exit. But yeah, so what is it that we need to feel that it is a worthwhile audience that we will foster? And I think Meredith has, you know, proposed a number of answers about like those disciplinary topics, but the answer might not be straightforward. And sometimes I think, you know, we all know colleagues who are perfectly content to talk to people who will remain within either their temporal or geographical fields, because either their research doesn't lend itself to it. And will they find a place within the CHA? Will they find the audience that they want or that they need? And sometimes I think so. Another way to frame my at least very basic and crude reflection on this is, like, sometimes it might be on the part of the CHA and doing stuff to make it a worthwhile audience for people who do not have Canadian component of their research. And sometimes it may be part of this in the CHA's camp or ball to actually foster a historical imagination that would make it so that people think that Canadianists have something to say to their own research. And I think those two elements are not quite the same, right? Because sometimes people would think like, what would Canadians have to say about, whatever it is that I'm working on? And sometimes the answer is maybe not that much. And so, please come talk to us and tell us. And sometimes the answer is quite a bit, actually. It's just that we rarely find ourselves in the same group. So thank you once again to everyone who participated in this wonderful conversation. I know it gave me a lot to think about, and I hope it did for you too. Alors, merci encore d'avoir participé. Et puis, je vous souhaite une bonne fin de journée et à la prochaine.